When fear speaks louder than facts, who really holds the power? This is episode 11, where we explore how terrorism thrives on panic and how calm may be our greatest defense. Welcome to this deep dive. We're tackling a really heady topic today, one that definitely shapes global politics, our anxieties, but we're using a fascinating lens.
Yeah, and that lens is from Yuval Noah Harari's book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. Specifically, we're digging into the chapter where he looks at terrorism, and it's quite surprising.
Okay, let's get into it then. Our goal here is really to unpack Harari's main point, which is kind of counterintuitive, that terrorism isn't really about the physical damage it causes, which he argues is often pretty minimal.
Right, it's more about its power to exploit our fear, to provoke us into overreacting.
So we want to understand what that actually means. How should we think about it? How should we react?
Well, the source starts with this definition that's key. Terrorism isn't just random violence, it's framed as a specific military strategy.
A military strategy? But how?
But, and this is crucial, it's a strategy used almost always by groups that are incredibly weak, militarily speaking. They can't actually defeat their enemy with force.
So they don't aim for material destruction.
Not primarily, no. Their goal is to spread fear, precisely because they lack the power to cause, significant material harm, like destroying armies or cities.
That's the first thing that jumps out, isn't it? That huge imbalance Harari points to.
Exactly. The gap between what terrorists can actually do, damage-wise, and the just immense global fear they manage to generate. It's astounding.
And the source uses numbers to really drive this home.
Yeah, the statistics are pretty stark. Globally, maybe around 25,000 deaths a year from terrorism. And it's vital to remember most of those are heavily concentrated in specific conflict zones. Think Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Nigeria.
Right, not necessarily evenly spread. And then he compares this.
Yeah, compare that 25,000 figure to other things. Traffic accidents, 1.25 million deaths globally each year.
Wow.
Diabetes, about 3.5 million deaths annually. Air pollution, something like 7 million deaths a year.
So statistically speaking, unless you're in one of those very specific high conflict areas, you're far, far more likely to be harmed by, well, sugar or just breathing the air.
Pretty much. Far more likely than by a terrorist attack.
The source breaks it down even further for places like Europe or the U.S.
Right. In the EU, the average might be around 50 deaths a year from terrorism. The U.S., maybe 10. China, around 7.
He gives that example from Israel, too, doesn't he? During a really intense period.
Yes, Israel in 2002, a peak year for attacks there. There were 451 deaths from terrorism. In the same year, 542 people died in car accidents.
More people died in cars, even then.
Even then. And then, if you zoom out even further and look at conventional war, it's just no contest.
Like World War I comparisons.
Exactly. The Battle of the Somme. On the first day, the British Army alone lost 19,000 soldiers killed, with another 40,000 wounded. One day.
Unbelievable numbers.
The whole battle saw over 1 million casualties. Other battles like Asan or Isanzo, you're talking hundreds of thousands dead or wounded.
So even the most horrific, memorable terrorist attacks we've seen, Paris in 2015, that was 130 dead. Brussels in 2016, 32. Manchester 2017, 22. Even something as huge as 9/11 with nearly 3,000 deaths.
Which was a profound human tragedy, absolutely.
Yeah.
But numerically, scale-wise, it's just on a completely different plane than conventional warfare. And the material damage, relative to a nation's overall capacity, also limited.
Okay, so if they can't win by force, if they can't cause decisive material damage, what is this strategy?
The core idea in the source is provocation. Their goal is to provoke the enemy, the state, into essentially harming itself.
How does that work?
Well, since they can't destroy the state's tanks or soldiers or infrastructure in any meaningful way, they aim to create such intense fear, such confusion, that the state misuses its own enormous power. It overreacts.
Okay, this is where that analogy comes in, the one about the fly.
Yes, the fly in the china shop. It's perfect.
Explain that again.
The terrorist group is the fly, tiny, weak, relatively harmless on its own. The state, with its armies and police and economy, is the huge, powerful bull. The china shop is, well, society, order, maybe international relations.
Right.
The fly itself can't break any china, it's too small. But its strategy is to buzz right into the bull's ear, annoy it, make it panic, drive it mad with fear and rage.
Until the bull just goes berserk.
Exactly, until the bull thrashes around wildly and smashes the entire china shop to pieces. The fly achieves its goal destruction not through its own power, but by manipulating the bull's power against itself.
So the terrorist success isn't measured by the bomb they set off,
Yeah.
but by the reaction it causes, by the China we break.
That's the core argument, yes, and contrast that with, say, a conventional military strike like Pearl Harbor.
Correct.
Japan wasn't trying to provoke an emotional overreaction, primarily. They were trying to inflict massive material damage, sink ships, destroy planes to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and change the actual military balance of power. That's conventional warfare.
Whereas terrorism, as Harari describes it, is often what you do when you can't do that, when you have no other military options.
Often, yes, it can be an act of sheer desperation from a position of extreme weakness.
It sounds less like military planning and more like, well, you said it before.
Like theater production. Harari makes that exact point. Terrorists don't think like army generals planning campaigns. They think like theater producers staging a spectacle.
The theater of terror. Makes sense.
It's all about capturing our imagination, creating this incredibly vivid, frightening drama that turns our own minds against us. They kill a few people, maybe, but the aim is to make millions feel personally unsafe, constantly looking over their shoulder.
The 9/11 example again really fits here. Why is the image of the Twin Towers collapsing so seared into our collective memory? More so arguably than the Pentagon attack.
Because the towers collapsing was visually and symbolically the ultimate terrifying performance. These huge, iconic symbols of global power just crumbling dramatically. It was pure spectacle.
Whereas the Pentagon, even though it was the enemy's military headquarters being hit.
Right, a significant military target. But the damage there was less visually dramatic, less theatrical. We instinctively judge terrorism, Harari argues, by its emotional impact, its showmanship, not its material effect.
And the state. How does it typically respond to this theater?
Often, the source suggests, with its own counter-theater, a show of security. Massive, visible displays of force, crackdowns, wars sometimes.
Which often become the overreaction the terrorists were aiming for.
Precisely, and this raises a really interesting question. Why are modern states, which are incredibly powerful, so hypersensitive to these relatively small-scale acts of violence?
Yeah, it's not like political violence is new. History is full of it.
Absolutely not. But the source makes a crucial point about the legitimacy of the modern state. It's largely built on a promise, a relatively new historical promise, to keep the public sphere free from political violence. Our streets, our cafes, our airports.
Places we expect to be safe from that kind of conflict.
Exactly. Think back to the Middle Ages. Political violence was everywhere. Lords had armed retainers, cities had walls, ambushes happened. A minor assassination or a brawl wouldn't necessarily shake the king's legitimacy because keeping everything peaceful wasn't the core promise.
He uses the Black Death example.
No, yeah. An unimaginable catastrophe killed maybe half of Europe, but people didn't generally overthrow their kings because of it. Preventing plagues wasn't seen as the state's fundamental job back then.
Or the other example about violence in France.
Right. He mentions the high number of reported sexual assaults in France each year. These are horrific crimes, a terrible social problem. Yeah. But they aren't generally perceived as an existential threat to the French state itself, to its right to rule.
Why not?
Because the modern state's core legitimacy wasn't founded on the promise of eliminating that kind of violence in the same way it was founded on eliminating political violence from the public square. That was the deal. Give us power, taxes, loyalty, and we'll stop the warlords fighting in your town square.
So, because modern states have actually been incredibly successful at doing that, at clearing out most political violence.
The public sphere has become remarkably quiet, historically speaking.
Okay.
And this creates what Harari calls the small coin in a big empty jar effect.
Right. Explain that.
Imagine a huge empty glass jar. It's silent inside. If you drop one tiny coin into it, it makes a disproportionately loud clatter echoing around.
Because there's nothing else making noise.
Exactly. Because we've cleared out most of the everyday political violence that was common throughout history, the public sphere is like that empty jar. Even a relatively small act of terrorism makes a huge, terrifying noise. It feels like a massive threat to the whole system.
So, paradoxically, the state's very success in providing security makes it more psychologically vulnerable to terrorism.
Yes, more vulnerable to the theater of terrorism. The perceived threat feels enormous because the background level of political violence is so low.
And that perceived threat, that amplified fear, makes the state feel it has to respond, not just effectively, but dramatically.
Right. They see the terrorist drama like the towers falling and feel compelled to stage an equally spectacular counter-drama. Think huge security measures, public displays of force, maybe even wars.
Instead of perhaps quieter, more effective behind-the-scenes intelligence work?
Often, yes. And that big, loud counter-drama is frequently exactly what the terrorists were hoping to provoke in the first place. It disrupts society, spends resources, changes policies, potentially alienates populations. It's the ball smashing the China.
Okay, so if that's the trap, how do we avoid it? How does the source suggest we actually combat terrorism effectively?
Well, Harari proposes a kind of three-front approach, but interestingly, it's less about directly fighting the terrorists themselves.
Oh, so what are the fronts?
The first front is the government's. Their role should be focused on the quiet, clandestine stuff. Good intelligence gathering, disrupting finances, infiltrating networks, targeted operations, effective, professional, largely unseen work.
So not the big, dramatic show of security that feeds the fear?
Exactly. Less theater, more effective backstage work. The second front is the media.
Ah, the media's role, that's huge.
Absolutely critical. The media needs to strive to keep things in perspective, avoid hysteria, resist the urge to give terrorist acts wall-to-wall coverage, because that's basically free advertising for the terrorists.
It amplifies their message, their
Yeah.
fear, right, even if unintentionally.
It does. Terrorism makes for dramatic news. It sells. But amplifying the theater is counterproductive to actually solving the problem. It plays right into their hands.
Okay, government doing quiet work, media keeping perspective. What's the third front?
The third front is us, the individual citizen, specifically our own imagination.
Our imagination. How?
Because, as we've said, terrorists work by capturing our imagination. They stage a horrifying event, and then our minds replay it, magnify it, imagine threats everywhere. They essentially hijack our internal fear mechanisms.
So we need to, what, reclaim our own minds?
In a sense, yes. We need to consciously liberate our imagination from their grip. Remind ourselves of the actual statistical reality of the threat versus other risks we accept daily. Cultivate a balanced, cool-headed reaction.
It sounds like the power is really in our response.
That's Harari's ultimate conclusion. Terrorism succeeds if we let our imagination be captured, if we overreact based on the fear they generate. It fails if we manage to free our imagination, see the threat in perspective, and react calmly and rationally. The success or failure isn't really determined by the terrorists. It's determined by our reaction.
Okay, that's a powerful framework.
Yeah.
But there's a big but coming, isn't there? A caveat in the source.
Yes, a very important one. This whole analysis, the theater, the relatively low damage, the focus on overreaction applies to terrorism as we've mostly known it so far.
Meaning attacks like Paris, 9/11, car bombs, shootings, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But Harari warns that the potential future threat of terrorism involving weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, maybe even highly sophisticated cyber attacks, that's a completely different ballgame.
Because in that scenario, a very small group could potentially inflict catastrophic material damage. Damage that genuinely threatens the existence of a state or kills millions.
Precisely. If terrorists got hold of, say, a nuclear bomb or engineered a truly devastating plague, they could potentially destroy that public sphere free of political violence in a very real, material way. The fly could suddenly have the power of the bull, or worse.
And that kind of potential threat does warrant a different level of concern and possibly a different kind of response from governments, right?
Absolutely. Preventing WMD terrorism is a critical security concern. But, and this is the crucial point Harari stresses, we must differentiate.
You mean?
Meaning the fear of a hypothetical future WMD attack shouldn't be used to justify a hysterical overreaction to the current, far less materially damaging forms of terrorism we actually face day to day.
Right. Don't treat every minor plot as if it's suitcase nukes, because that leads back to the same overreaction trap for conventional terrorism.
Exactly. You need different strategies for different levels of threat. Don't use the nightmare scenario of WMDs to justify, say, mass surveillance or military adventures in response to groups that simply don't have that capability.
This ties into the idea of opportunity costs, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which the source also touches on.
Yes, heavily. Think about the war on terror launched after 9/11. Trillions of dollars spent. Immense political capital used up, huge military and intelligence resources deployed.
Right.
Now, proponents might argue, well, maybe that prevented nuclear terrorism, and maybe it did, maybe it didn't. It's a counterfactual, hard to prove.
Right.
But what we know for sure is that all that money, all that focus, all that political energy was not spent on other massive global challenges.
Like climate change.
Like climate change, like tackling AIDS or pandemics, like alleviating extreme poverty, like managing the complex geopolitical shifts involving powers like Russia or China. Those trillions could only be spent once.
So future historians might look back and say, they were so focused on this one type of threat, potentially amplified by fear, that they missed the chance to address these other, possibly larger, slower-moving crises.
It's a definite possibility. And Harari acknowledges how hard it is to set priorities in real time. Looking back at the 90s, people worried about Russia collapsing or Germany reunifying or China cracking down, maybe neglecting the rise of al-Qaeda seems obvious in hindsight. But at the time, those other issues seemed huge.
You can't prepare for absolutely everything.
You can't. Choices have to be made. But the point remains. While preventing the terrifying possibility of WMD terrorism is obviously crucial, it shouldn't become the only thing that matters. And its theoretical possibility shouldn't justify irrational overreactions to the standard terrorism we actually encounter, which operates primarily on the level of psychological theater.
So, wrapping it up, the core takeaway from the source seems to be that the power of most terrorism we see today lies less in its physical impact.
And much more in the fear and reaction it generates within us, within our societies, and within our governments.
It's a psychological game, a performance.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
A deadly serious one, but a performance nonetheless designed to manipulate our emotions. And winning against it, therefore, requires understanding that dynamic and controlling our response. It's about managing our own fear and imagination.
Which really leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If our perception of the terrorist threat is often, as the source argues, significantly out of proportion to the statistical reality amplified by fear, maybe amplified by living in an era of unprecedented safety, what other areas of life, what other risks or problems might we be collectively overreacting to simply because we've lost that historical perspective on what constitutes a normal level of danger or uncertainty? Something to think about. That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.